Hey everybody, and welcome back to Northwest Small Batch Brewing. I'm Steven, and I hope you are having a fantastic day. Today I want to talk about something that sort of bugs me. There's sometimes things that people tell you and you go, man, that's not right. And then you find proof it's not right, and they just keep telling you, oh, no, you're wrong. So there's a bunch of these kinds of things in the home brewing community. And I think they're just left over from a bygone era. It's kind of like when you see a Soviet building, that is from years ago and somehow still standing, and in use. It's the same idea. You have these myths and ideas that people have about brewing that just don't have any basis in fact. In fact, they've been proven wrong, yet somehow people still hold on to these ideas. So anyway, before we get started and go any further into that rabbit hole, take a look around my channel. I have a whole bunch of videos on home brewing and experiments and this and that. If you like what you see, it would help me out a lot if you hit the subscribe button, and you can use the bell icon to adjust how you're notify whenever I put out a new video. And then, of course, hitting the likes up button really helps get my video on the search engine on YouTube. So I appreciate it. It means a lot. So let's get started. So, by the way, there is an actual term for this idea that a person has a maybe old-fashioned idea that's been proven wrong or whatever, and they just refuse to let go of it. It's called cognitive dissonance. It's when somebody believes something so fervently and so hard that they flat out will not even consider, even when facts are placed right in front of them and people show them, in real time, look, what you always thought was the truth is not. People still flat out refuse to accept that they might be wrong. And the problem is, at that point, you are never going to convince that person, no matter how much proof you have, that they are mistaken or that they were given wrong information at some point. Or maybe it's just that, the idea of it has evolved and people have learned more and it has changed the way people think. But some people just refuse to accept that. For example, I still see today, I was just thinking that I was going to pour myself a beer. Dang it. That's all right. I'll wait till after. There's still people today that believe that if you squeeze the grain bag, it will release tannins into your beer and create astringency. And it's just not true. It's just not true. It's been proven time and time again. I squeeze the grain bag when I do a brew in a bag, and it's not true. And for some reason, I don't know if someone heard it somewhere or it was just kind of passed down through the ages, but there are still people today who insist that's the case when it's not. So I'm here today to talk to you about something called dimethyl sulfide. Now, I will post a link up in the corner here because I did a video on a whole slew of things that can cause your beer to smell bad or taste bad, different kinds of infections and things, right? And how do you maybe figure out what the infection is and has it ruined your beer? So check out that video. It's a good rundown of stuff that I think every home brewer should know, just so that they have a sort of guide to tell them what's going on with their beer when it does something weird. So I do have dimethyl sulfide in that video, but I want to kind of do an additional little video here on it. So first of all, what is dimethyl sulfide? And I'm going to start calling it DMS because it's easier to say. So DMS is a compound that is formed from something that is in grain. Now, it doesn't just occur in grain, but for our purposes, that's where it's occurring, in the grain that you buy. It has a very disagreeable odor. It is responsible for the smell that would be produced when you cook certain vegetables. So I'm talking about corn. So you might get a cooked corn smell from it. Cabbage. We all know what cabbage stinks like when it's cooked. Beetroot, asparagus, all that kind of stuff produces this smell that is a result of DMS. So you don't want that in your beer. Although I will say if you're making a darker beer or a very strongly flavored beer like a IPA, you're probably going to hide any potential DMS smell in your beer. So it may not be as big a deal. But lighter beers, lagers that are very delicate and don't have a lot to hide behind in flavor, DMS could be a real problem. So how do we get rid of it, right? It's in the grain, and when you heat that grain up, you crack the grain and heat it up in your mash, it's the heating of the grain that releases that chemical compound that produces that smell. So you've mashed your beer, and now you have all this DMS in it because you heated it up to get the water warm and to get all the good stuff out of it. So how do you get rid of it? Well, we need to make it volatile, meaning we need it to boil out and turn into a gas and evaporate, out, which is one of the main reasons we do a boil after we do our mash. Obviously, the main reason is to sort of sanitize everything, but also it's to get rid of DMS. Now, that's one way to get rid of it. Let's talk about a few other things that maybe people don't know about DMS. Let's talk about, fermentation, like when you put your yeast in and it's fermenting. Believe it or not, DMS is produced during fermentation. So even after you've boiled the wort and you've cooled it down and you've put it in your, fermenter and you pitch in the yeast and you think, okay, I'm good to go. It's kind of weird that low temperature yeast can create DMS. Believe it or not, this is just something I was reading, that the maximum DMS level that you can get with a fermentation at 46%, so if you're Fahrenheit, sorry, I'll put the Celsius in the video here, but if you're fermenting at 46 Fahrenheit, it is 5 times greater the amount of DMS that's created than if you do a fermentation at, say, 77 degrees Fahrenheit. So I guess if you're doing a lager and you're doing a pressure fermentation at a higher temperature, like 75, 77 degrees, your chance of getting DMS is lower, which seems weird, right? I can't explain the math behind that. I don't know what the cause is because it goes counter, I think, to what we would think, that the lower the temperature, the more DMS that pulls out of it. But so you can see how lagering would actually increase DMS, making DMS even a bigger problem. Not only are you producing a beer that's a very delicate, lightly flavored beer where DMS is going to be noticed more, but you also lager it at a lower temperature, ferment it even at a lower temperature, and that can create additional DMS. Okay, so that's something to think about. Sugar. This is really interesting. So if you add up to 10% of sucrose to your boil, it will actually help you increase the evaporation of DMS out of your beer, your wort at that point. So that's interesting. And again, I don't know the cause, but yeah, adding sugar to your total bill helps remove DMS. The only thing I don't like about that is I feel like sugar gives you, well, it's going to increase the ABV, but it's not going to do anything else for you. It's going to make it more, in my opinion, my flavor palette, it tastes more astringent, more dry a beer, because basically sugar ferments out 100%. So you're just going to get alcohol from it and nothing else, no body. So I'm not a fan of adding sugar to beer generally. But it's an interesting thought that adding a small amount of sugar helps get rid of DMS if you do it during the boil. Yeast starters. These are real popular these days, right? Collecting the yeast at the bottom of your beer when it's done, and then using it to create a yeast starter to add to your next beer. This can be a problem because apparently they have discovered that, most people, what they'll do is they'll take that yeast and they'll put it into a Erlenmeyer flask, and then they put that on a plate with a magnetic bar that they throw into it, and the plate uses magnetism to move the bar in a circle really fast. So it keeps your yeast agitated and moving. Well, the more you agitate your yeast that you've pulled, the more DMS is going to be built up in that yeast starter. In fact, it can increase the DMS levels by 25%. The only thing I've heard of as far as how to sort of avoid that is to make sure you have a healthy yeast starter, meaning have a good amount of yeast in your starter so that you have a really good colony to use. What else? The pH level of your wort. Interesting, I have not, I just got a pH meter because I got a really cheap one on the Amazon Prime Day. And I just caught my eye on it. I was like, I've never checked my pH. It's never been a problem. But, it's super cheap. Why not get one and just out of curiosity, check it out and see. So anyway, the pH level of your wort affects your DMS level. So the higher the pH in your wort, the higher your DMS. So if your pH is like 5 or higher, you're going to have much more DMS than if your pH is like 4.2 or 4.3 or at the lower end of the scale. So that's something to think about, is especially with making a lager, is that you don't want it to have the wort be too high starting pH level. What else? We're going to get to a couple myths here in a minute. Rapid boils. So to get rid of the DMS, what we commonly do and has been done for a long time is to do a good rapid rolling boil on your wort. That's good, and if anybody who has done this knows, it creates a bunch of foam. If you're not seeing the foam and what we call it like a potential boil over, then you're not boiling it hard enough. It will come if you can do that. Well, they're saying make sure you do not skim the foam off the top of the beer. You do that with certain things like in cooking where you skim, the muck off the top. You don't want to do that with your beer that you're doing it with your wort, because the vaporization of DMS is enhanced significantly with the presence of the beer foam. So DMS actually concentrates in the foam that forms on top of your beer, and then it's stripped from the wort by the rising vapor of the boil. Interesting, right? So don't try to stir the foam back in. If you need to, turn the temperature down for a moment, but the foam is good for getting rid of DMS. Okay, last bit here before we finish up this video is a couple of myths. Again, this is the real thing that kind of sticks in my side, where I hate when I see this, because there's a lot of people out on a lot of forums and in the homebrewing community and different places where people are getting their information, much like this channel here. And it's really painful to see misinformation. Now, things can change and evolve, and new information can be, discovered. So things are always changing, but you should always be open to that, just because you did it one way or learned that it was supposed to be done a certain way does not mean that's going to necessarily always be that way.
It's a trap!
So, first myth is that you have to chill your wort down quickly to stop the formation of DMS. You'll read this a lot, and you'll hear about this a lot, that you need to quickly chill down your wort with a wort chiller or a plate chiller or a water or an ice water bath. Whatever it is, you have to cool it down as quickly as possible, because if the wort remains at a high temperature, it will continue to create DMS that gets into your beer, into your wort. It's just not true. I don't know if that information is just theory and someone is spouting that as theory, and it makes sense, right? That if it's still warm, it might still be producing this stuff. However, I myself and countless others, I mean, just look at our friendly homebrewers down in Australia, do no-chill beers all the time and have no issue with DMS. So it's just not true. If you see somebody say that you have to chill the wort down super fast, it's not true. Is there a chance that you're going to have an infection more easily the longer you leave it at a higher temperature? Yeah, but you know what? I've done countless no-chill beers. I mean, you don't leave it open. You let it cool down to a point. I usually let it cool down to like 170 Fahrenheit, which is like about the pasteurization temperature, and then I put a lid on and then sort of seal it with saran wrap or something, and then you can let it cool the rest of the way on its own. The point being is you don't just leave it open. As you know, as soon as you're able to, you put a lid on it and seal it up, and nothing's getting in there. So yeah, it's really a huge myth. So number 2, you can't boil with the lid on, because if you put the lid on the pot, then as it's boiling, the DMS that's in the evaporated water can't escape from the kettle. This is partially true. This is partially true. You do need, that's one of the biggest reasons for boiling the wort, is to let the DMS evaporate out. However, you don't need to have the entire pot open to the air in order to do that. Just ask the guys over at Clawhammer, and they will tell you so. I have one of their systems that I use for brewing, as a matter of fact. And if you leave just maybe a ½ inch even crack in one side, what they do and what I've started doing is just using the hop spider. If you leave that on there, just put the lid on, that will create like a ½ inch gap. And that's enough. As long as there's a gap where the steam can get out of the kettle, it's enough to let the DMS out. So don't let anybody tell you that you have to have the lid completely off. People have been making hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of beers using the Clawhammer system and doing it this way. Leaving the lid on and just a crack lets you get a more vigorous boil as well. So yes, you need to let the water evaporate out. No, you don't need the entire pot to be open with no lid. And finally, the final myth. CO2 releases DMS from the beer. Now I've heard, I'm not going to say what YouTube it is, but I have heard a YouTube channel saying that you need to degas your brew because all the gases and the CO2 that's in it is old and it will smell, and you need to get that all out of there and get new fresh CO2 in there. That's ridiculous. Here's why I'm saying it's ridiculous. Number one is I've never degassed and done that, and I've never noticed any off flavors from it. Secondly, I have done pressure fermentation, just like a lot of people have been doing lately. And if you're doing pressure fermentation, all of the CO2 and any gases and whatnot that are produced by the beer, by the fermentation process, most of it's being kept, it's being forced back into the beer. The only part that's released is if you set, whatever you set your, pressure at. If it's say 12 psi or whatever, then it's obviously going to release some of it. But the rest of it is keeping under pressure and it's pushing into your beer. And then you just take the whole fermenter when it's ready and stick it into the kegerator, and don't even move it to a new vessel. Hello?
Hello!
all that CO2 that's in there is what has been produced by the yeast. So if there's DMS in it, your beer is going to taste terrible. And I've never had that happen. And I do pressure fermentation every time I can. So there's no way that CO2 is releasing DMS from the beer. I will say this, it is possible if you have DMS present in your beer, that as the CO2 bubbles come up, the smell, the odor that it gives off could be trapped inside it, and then it bursts when it hits the top and releases that odor, right? That's not removing the DMS. It might just be taking the odor up to the surface and pulling it out, but it's not actually removing DMS from the beer. So yeah, CO2 releasing DMS, no. So degassing to get rid of old gas that might smell bad, no. So it's not true. It's a myth. It's not true, and it's another one of those things that I wish would not be, repeatedly. I wish would not be repeated constantly throughout the homebrewing world. All right, so that's all I have for you today. I will end with a video clip here that'll show up in the corner with a link to my wheat beer. It's a wheat wine technically. The reason being is that it turned out amazing. It's really fantastic. Everyone who's tried it loves it, and I'd love to see the views on it go up because I would like more people to have the opportunity to make it. It's a great recipe, a great beer. So if you're into wheat beers, give it a look and try it out. I think you'll like it. That's all I have. So I will see you in a week. And until then, happy brewing and stay out of the DMS. See you soon.